Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. We are going to let our audience settle in for just a minute here before we start today's Safety and Health Magazine webcast sponsored by JJ Keller, and we'll be with you shortly. Thank you. Thanks again to everyone joining us today. We'll start the presentation shortly. Well, a formal hello to everyone, and welcome to today's Safety and Health Magazine webcast. Forklift operator training. It's more than just an OSHA regulation. Sponsored by JJ Keller. My name is Barry Botino. I'm an associate editor at Safety and Health and a co-host of our On the Safe Side podcast. I'll be the moderator for today's event. Before we get started, I want to share a few housekeeping items with everyone. First, the views of today's speaker and organization are their own and do not necessarily reflect those of the National Safety Council or Safety and Health magazine. Any mention of a commercial enterprise, product, or publication does not mean the council or the magazine endorses those items. After today's event, we'll conduct a Q&A with our speakers. If you have a question at any time, just click that Q&A button located at the bottom of your screen, type in your question, and press the send button. After this presentation, you'll also be asked to complete a brief evaluation survey, but I'll tell you more about that a little later. Finally, this webcast will be archived. If you want to view this presentation or any of our past webcasts, please go to safetyandhealthmagazine.com/events. You may also receive a link in our post-event email. Now let's introduce our speakers. Joining us today are Gina Godin and Ed Zaleski. Gina is a valued member of the JJ Keller EHS content team and has 10 years of experience as a safety manager in the construction, mining, and manufacturing industries. She writes about a variety of topics, including lockout tagout, personal protective equipment, confined spaces, and working from height. Ed has been with JJ Keller since 1999, covering a wide spectrum of safety-focused topics and diligently researching laws and regulations to keep customers up to date. His expertise includes topics such as working surfaces, powered industrial trucks, and injury and illness record keeping. He's also a frequent speaker at compliance events around the country. With that, welcome Gina, and please take it away.
Okay, yes, thank you very much. So today's webcast is sponsored by JJ Keller. JJ Keller Training Solutions cover a broad range of topics and are available in a variety of formats, including training on demand, DVD, streaming video, and video books. Plenty of options to help you meet your needs. So these are all backed by regulatory experts, and using the latest techniques and technology, our training solutions give your employees the proper instruction they need. So on behalf of our sponsor, JJ Keller, thanks for joining us today. So here's what we're going to be covering during today's webcast. We're going to be talking about forklift training, specifically as it relates to general industry. OSHA does have a very comprehensive standard at 1910.178, which honestly is one of the better written OSHA standards, in my opinion. It is very clear and very thorough as far as the regulations and requirements. So we'll go through those in detail. And then we'll certainly spend some time on the OSHA training requirements, in particular, since that is the topic of today's webcast. There are certain training requirements that must be met, but we'll also branch out a bit and try to shed some light on a few issues that either the OSHA requirements don't necessarily address or that they don't address in great detail. So we'll give you some best practices and kind of go over some specific examples as well. Including, who can conduct training, what topics should be covered in that training, and then as well as when refresher training should be conducted. We're also going to be covering topics like training the operator on forklift inspections, operating in designated areas, speed limits, operating on ramps and inclines, unloading trailers, and then we'll explain some of OSHA's definitions, including a common question that we get is, what is the definition of an unattended forklift and why that's important? So we thought it would be fun to include some audience interaction as well, where we'll ask some engaging questions to get to know your unique situation. So please be on the lookout for that. The chat is open and we will have some polls throughout the presentation today as well. Also keep in mind, we will leave time at the end of our presentation to answer as many of your questions as possible. So also keep in mind that we won't necessarily get to all of them if we do have a lot of questions coming in, but we do strongly encourage you to submit those questions again through the Q&A box as they come to mind throughout this webcast. So with that being said, let's give this interactive chat feature a try right now. So remember, this is separate from the Q&A box. So we are curious, just how many forklifts do you manage at your facility at any given time? We know we have a variety of different attendees here in the presentation today. So please use the poll to indicate, do you manage 1 to 10 forklifts, 11 to 20, 21 to 30, or do some of you have more than you can even count? So while you're submitting those responses into the chat box, we want to answer one common question that we often receive, and that is, do forklifts need to have backup alarms or warning lights? Well, I think the answer may surprise you. OSHA does not have a requirement that forklifts need to be equipped with either. Now, OSHA does say that a forklift must have a sound producing device, such as a horn. And OSHA also cautions employers that certain operating conditions may require the use of additional warning devices like a backup alarm. So it's really going to be up to the employer to determine if that type of safeguard would be necessary. Now, keep in mind that if you do have a backup alarm or a warning light on your forklift, it needs to be functioning properly. So that is the key. If you have it, it needs to be working. So we're getting quite a few of you entering your responses. So thank you to everyone who participated in this chat engagement feature. So let's go through. We've got a lot of people who have 1 to 10. We have some people with 11 to 20, mostly people who have less than 10, but I do see some people who have 21 or more in here as well. So again, a good variety. I definitely can relate to the people who have fewer forklifts. My experience has been managing 10 or fewer, and I cannot even imagine being in the shoes of someone who has more than they can even count. So thank you for joining us today. It's a great first step in learning about compliance and training requirements. Okay, so moving on, who can conduct operator training? Here at JJ Keller, we often get a lot of forklift training questions from clients, but the one that we get the most is definitely who can even conduct the training. So let's start with that. Now, OSHA does state that all operator training and evaluation must be conducted by persons who have the knowledge, training, and experience to train operators and evaluate their competence. The standard does not go into more detail than that. It's really up to the employer to ensure that whoever is doing the training meets these general qualifications. But OSHA has no specific requirements for trainers to, take certain classes or hold any sort of certification or to even be recertified as trainers at any specific interval. The key here really is just that the employer has determined that the trainer has the knowledge, training, and experience. The only aspect of this that OSHA has clarified is that the trainer does need to have experience operating the equipment. So an OSHA letter of interpretation from July 23rd, 2003 says that the trainer will only have sufficient experience if they have the practical skills and judgment to be able to operate the equipment themselves. So for example, if the employer uses certain truck attachments, say a barrel lift to move around, 55-gallon drums, the trainer has to have experience using that attachment and that style forklift in order to be effectively train other workers. So if the trainer does not have experience using that particular attachment, then they would not have, in OSHA's eyes, the experience necessary to train and evaluate others. at least not on the safe use of that particular attachment. Another aspect of the standard is that it does not require the trainers to operate a forklift regularly, so outside of their regular operating training duties, as part of their job function or responsibility. So it could still be a supervisor or somebody else. It doesn't have to necessarily be somebody who operates a forklift daily. Now, effective trainers, you might be asking yourself, just what makes an effective trainer and how can you identify those individuals within your organization? Well, you can go about it in a few different ways. Certainly, they do need to know the OSHA regulations, or at least know where to find them and learn about them. Most importantly, though, they do need to have experience operating the equipment, as I just mentioned, but they need to be committed to training. They need to be good communicators. And, you can have someone who's a really great forklift operator, but do they really want to train others? Are they committed to the training? And importantly, do they have the communication skills to transfer that knowledge onto the trainees? Many operators do, but some don't. So just make sure you keep that in mind if you're selecting a new trainer at your facility. Certainly, though, you can coach up those potential trainers too. So maybe you have someone who's a great operator, but just needs a little bit of help becoming a trainer, then it might be worth your while to send them out to a train the trainer class. Just make sure to set some criteria of your own for when an operator can become a trainer. It shouldn't just be because they have operated the equipment for X number of years without an incident. So make sure you've really observed the operators and feel that they are safety minded, because you certainly don't want a trainer who is going to be passing along shortcuts to new employees. So third party trainers, this is another common question that we get. Many employers will utilize third-party trainers for at least some of their operator training, and there's certainly nothing wrong with doing this. Many third-party trainers or consultants, have great experience in both forklift operation and training, so they can seem like a natural fit. But just make sure that you check their credentials, particularly in light of the type of workplace that you operate in. So, for example, if you operate a retail distribution center, make sure that they're familiar with how forklifts are used in that type of work environment. Also, it's usually best if you bring in the third party trainer to do the training at your facility. There are several reasons for this, mainly because they can train on your own equipment and in your unique operations where the operators will ultimately be working anyway. Um, but if you do send your operators out to a class or on an off-site training center, then do keep in mind that you still have to evaluate them in your workplace. You'll also need to supplement the training that they've learned outside in a different classroom setting with your own truck and your own workplace specific training requirements. So, for example, if your work environment has inclines and ramps, you have to make sure that the trainer is covering that specific topic. So, really, again, nothing wrong with using third party trainers, but just be aware that it may not be totally, um, it may not totally relieve you of your training duties. So, do keep that in mind when evaluating third party trainers. And with that, I'm going to pass it on to Ed, and he's going to be talking about the initial training requirements.
Thank you, Gina, and thank you for everyone for joining us today. So, regardless of who you have delivered the training, OSHA does have a specific list of requirements that must be met. So, I'm going to talk about those briefly, along with, again, some common questions we get from clients. So, we've been getting forklift questions for many years, and the same ones just keep coming up. Okay, so first, OSHA requires that all operators must be trained before they're allowed to operate a forklift. Not a surprise. The same thing though goes for pallet trucks, so powered pallet jacks, order pickers, stand-up units, any type of powered industrial truck covered under that 1910-178 regulation. And all operators must receive a combination of training. It's got to include formal training, practical training, and a hands-on evaluation. Now, formal training can be a lecture, discussion, Could be interactive computer training. I mean, you can do the videos and things here online. Videotape. When I started at Keller, we used to mail videotapes to people, if you can imagine that. Written material, things like that. The practical training then refers to generally demonstrations performed by the trainer and then those practical exercises performed by the trainee. Do as I do. And then when it comes to evaluation, employees need to operate the equipment and be observed and evaluated before they can be considered, fully trained. They would perform typical routine tasks in the workplace. And this is one of those cases where I think the OSHA standard actually does a good job of being pretty clear and helping the employer understand exactly what the requirements are. So typically, you'll introduce general concepts during the classroom portion, the more informational aspects, the OSHA requirements, stability triangle. And then you'll use the practical part of the training to familiarize the operators with the equipment controls. You talk about load handling and things like that. And keep in mind with the practical training, it's usually best to kind of ramp up or increase the complexity of that portion gradually. You start with fairly simple skills and then build on those by adding in an additional task or an additional skill one at a time. Now, aside from requirements for how to conduct the training, OSHA gives us a detailed list of what topics to cover during the training. The two broad categories are truck related topics and workplace related topics. So remember, OSHA requires you to include information on the forklift standard, 1910-178, as part of the training program. And that can be easily overlooked. So a good way to approach that is in the classroom portion of the program. And then as we go over these truck and workplace related topics, keep in mind if a particular area doesn't apply to your trucks or your workplace, you don't have to train on it. So, for example, if there aren't any ramps or inclines in your facility, well, then your operators don't need training on that topic. But the way the standard is written, you may want to have something to sort of support your decision to skip a topic in case an OSHA inspector asks about it. So, one way to do that could be to have a written statement that survey and evaluation of the workplace found that there were no ramps or inclines in the facility, and then sign and date that and keep that statement on file just in case. And of course, if your work environment changes, you'll want to conduct an updated survey so you keep the training program up to date. Maybe you've done some renovation or building. And while we're talking about training program content, again, if you need help satisfying OSHA's forklift operator training requirements, consider JJ Keller's forklift training program. This online e-learning course is designed to help learners choose, interpret, and inspect and operate a forklift in a safe way. They can protect themselves and their coworkers from potential hazards associated with this use. And this program is useful for new operators, and it can be a good refresher safety training in the event of an incident or near miss. Maybe someone had a poor evaluation. Maybe you had changes in the workplace. And since JJ Keller Training is sponsoring today's event, we are offering all attendees complimentary access to this training course. So we're going to put a poll up on your screen. We'd like you to use that to select your areas of interest. And as a thank you, you'll receive our popular white paper on powered industrial truck training. And while you're doing that, I want to take a question that we commonly get, and this one I've seen again many times over the years. Can a forklift operator wear headphones while operating a forklift? We get questions on listening to music and things too. Headphones are a great question, though. You know, OSHA's occupational noise exposure, the Power Industrial Truck Standard, they really don't address the use of headphones in the workplace. But OSHA has issued letters of interpretation that do not recommend headphones. In particular, a huge concern for a forklift operator. Even if you're in a noisy environment where hearing protection is required, well, now you're not only blocking out external noise, but you've added a new level of sound that further drowns out workplace noise. And that's dangerous. The operator might not hear alarms, might not hear shouted warnings, might not hear the beep of another forklift. And there could be also exposing themselves to noise level that is higher than what you would want. And if you're in a hearing conservation program, right, we don't want people listening to something loud and damaging their hearing. So you have every right as an employer to prohibit using headphones while someone is operating a forklift. All right, I am going to move on then and talk about the truck related topics that OSHA requires you to cover. These are going to be shown here and on the next slide. Actually, next couple of slides, we'll go through these. Now, I'm not going to cover every one of these in detail. That would take a long time, but we did want to at least list them out for you. Much of this information can actually be found in the forklift operator manual. Every vehicle should come with an operator manual. And in fact, OSHA expects operators to have training on the information in the manual. There's probably stuff specific to the unit. So when you take a close look at these topics, they kind of make sense. I mean, everything on the list is something that a forklift operator would need to know. For example, providing instruction on the differences between a forklift and an automobile is a good idea because operating a forklift feels completely different from driving a car. By the way, common question we get, you don't need a driver's license to get a forklift operator license, but your new forklift operators, if they're used to driving cars, well, their initial expectations may be that, hey, it's kind of like driving. Well, it's not. Same thing with visibility. Even an unloaded forklift has blind spots, and the operator wouldn't necessarily know this right off the bat. They wouldn't be familiar with where those are. And of course, here's the rest of the list. You notice that you have to train on capacity and stability, including the stability triangle. Using the capacity or data plates is a good way to introduce this topic. Remember to let your trainees know that the forklift capacity is calculated under ideal conditions using a standard load center. So, unless every load they pick up is perfectly centered and shaped and balanced, then the capacity might be less. And again, the forklift data plate will have the load center information listed on it. A lot of these truck related topics you see on your screen, they lend themselves to that practical part of the training program. It's easier to demonstrate how the controls work than describe them during a classroom lecture. But you may still want to introduce these topics during the formal or classroom portion because it's easier to have discussions and answer questions. Consider using photos of your trucks or diagrams from your own equipment operating manuals to give your trainees a solid foundation of that information before they go get hands on the truck. Okay, and then moving on from the truck related topics, we want to talk about workplace related topics. Now, this is information that's unique to your facility. We can't put this in our training videos. You're not going to find it in third-party products. Uh, those videos and things that they are valuable additions to to your program. Your employees will learn a lot, but as you use training materials, you need to add in workplace specific information. Your operators need this to navigate safely. So, what type of surfaces are they going to operate on? Is it smooth? Is it rough? Gravel handles differently than a nice smooth concrete floor. If it is smooth floors, are they waxed? Do you have ramps? Are they going to be indoors or outdoors? Is there going to be snow or ice if they're outdoors? Will they be traveling over railroad tracks? Are they going into trailers? Any bumps to worry about? All of these things need to be covered in training. And as you can imagine, it's very critical to safe operation. And with that, I am going to pass it back to Gina to talk about evaluating your operators.
Great. Okay. Thank you, Ed. Yes. So let's discuss evaluating an operator. And we talked about how trainees need to successfully complete the formal training and the practical instruction, but how you determine success is really up to you. So for the classroom portion, you could give a written or an oral test to evaluate your trainee's knowledge. But for the practical portion, the trainee should be able to safely perform all of the operations that are going to be used on the job. Now, lastly, OSHA does require a performance evaluation. So what does that mean? Well, essentially, you need to observe your trainees operating pretty much all of their primary tasks. So things like loading and stacking, refueling, tiering, using attachments, going through the inspection process, traveling, maneuvering, entering trailers, things like that. So for the initial evaluation, you want to make sure that this is done in a safe place under close supervision. And then for the 3-year evaluation, it should be done as part of the operator's, as the operator is performing their regular duties. So you can do a simple observation. Don't even necessarily need to let them know you're there observing them. for that 3-year evaluation. You just need to be able to observe them operating in their regular job duties. And really, a point about this that I want to make is that the evaluation shouldn't be considered complete until you have observed the operator performing safely, again, all of their primary tasks. So, depending on what types of tasks the operators perform, this could take an hour, it could take a day, or it might need to be performed over the course of several days at different times, depending on your operation. So finally, once you've successfully evaluated the trainee, they are ready to get to work. There's no probationary period or anything like that. They are able to operate in their regular job duties. Now, a question you might ask is, how do you prove you've completed all the necessary training? Well, the proof of the certification required by OSHA at, again, the 1910 178 standard, um, under L6. So what does that certification consist of? It simply means placing a record on file that includes the name of the operator, the date of the training, the date of the evaluation, and then the identity of the person performing the training or the evaluation. No, it doesn't mean that employers must issue the employees a license or wallet card or any tangible certification. Though many employers do choose to do that, wallet cards can certainly help your supervisors out by being able to quickly determine, what kind of equipment the employees have been trained on and that sort of thing. It also reinforces to operators just how critical forklift operation is. Having something tangible that states, yes, I can operate this piece of equipment. It really does say a lot. So even though OSHA doesn't require it, it's not a bad idea for employers to issue those cards. And I will say, especially in the construction industry, that is common where we have employees who are going from different job sites, to have something tangible that they can show other contractors if needed. And just as a side note, I've underlined the word employers here on the slide, because that's a key point in many ways. It's up to the employer who issues the certification. So no matter whether you send an operator outside to a third party training class, the employer must ultimately, make that certification and put it in writing or have it on record, for OSHA to see if they do ever come on site for an inspection. Now, also, if you have operations in the state of Michigan, they do require wallet cards in Michigan. That's covered under Michigan's regulation, R408. However, it doesn't apply to motorized hand trucks. So that's just one example of a state-specific requirement that you need to keep in mind, depending on, where everyone is located and where you're operating your forklifts. Now, next, let's talk about refresher training. So, OSHA requires refresher training whenever one of the 5 situations occur. So, perhaps the operator has been observed operating the vehicle in an unsafe manner. That would trigger refresher training. Or the operator has been involved in an incident or a near miss incident. That would also trigger retraining. If the operator has received an evaluation that reveals that they're not running the truck safely, or if the operator is assigned to drive a different type of truck or a different type of work truck, or if any other condition in the workplace changes in a manner that could affect the safe operation of the truck. So these are the 5 situations that would trigger refresher training. So you'll need to conduct refresher training in those situations. There's not a set time frame, and keep in mind that if you have an operator that's been observed operating, the vehicle in an unsafe manner, or they've been involved in an incident or a near miss, training might not always be the answer to these issues. It would certainly be a component of the action steps taken for that situation. But for example, if you have an operator who's been written up multiple times for continually speeding, you may want to ask yourself if more training really is going to fix this issue. It may or it may not. It may be, maybe the first time, but after that, clearly training isn't working. So you might need to find the root cause. Is that operator under tight deadlines and feeling pressured to get the job done quickly? If that's the case, then you may need to look at your policies and what might be going on there. or looking at management practices. If that's not the case and it's just the operator, ignoring safety rules, then perhaps you do have an issue with your overall discipline program. Again, retraining may be a component of that solution, but it may not answer the entire big picture. Now, since we just talked about refresher training, we are wondering if you have ever had to deliver that training after any of those situations. So again, it could be an incident or a near miss, an observation of unsafe behavior, perhaps an evaluation that uncovered problems. You were out observing somebody and saw something that was unsafe to either the operator or nearby pedestrians. Maybe you've had two or more of these situations occur. Better still, maybe you've never had to conduct refresher training because of these situations listed here. But we would like to kind of get some feedback from the audience here, and please select the appropriate response based on your experience. And while you're doing that, we'll give you guys a couple of minutes to submit those answers. But if you ever have had to deliver refresher training, we're also opening up the chat feature to tell us briefly about it. So what was that situation? Was it unsafe behavior? Let us know in the chat your experience with refresher training. And one quick reminder, we want to let you know that documenting the 3-year evaluation and any additional training provided can also be helpful. So while we give you a couple more moments, let's look at the chat and see if there's any other additional areas you've had to deliver refresher training. When we've had different type of forklifts after an accident, after a near miss, observing unsafe operations. So I guess, yeah, kind of a variety. We have a 3-year certification expired. Lots of different answers in here. Some people have had 2 or more of these situations trigger refresher training. So again, it definitely have a good representation here of different experience on retraining. So thank you for participating in that. And feel free to continue using the chat if you have anything else you'd like to add.
Yeah,
But
Gina, these are always interesting, aren't they? To see, what what the numbers are and get a feel for this. And I just wanted to throw out there at the risk of taking up more time on this. Gina was saying we so often get questions on the operator, or excuse me, the trainer qualifications. And for kicks from several years ago, one of my coworkers got a list of OSHA citations by paragraph. And so I looked up like how many times, this was a few years ago, how many times did they cite an employer for having an unqualified trainer? And the number of citations under that paragraph was 1 for the entire year. I
mhm.
suspect that person was training using equipment that they had not that they didn't have any experience operating. So, training citations come up a lot, but they don't often question your trainer all that much. When you see these accidents and things, though, if OSHA sees that, they're like, well, clearly you have a training shortfall, right, Gina?
Right. Yes, exactly. And I just want to point out one other item, and a reminder, please submit your questions in the Q&A and not in the chat so we don't miss any. But I did see one come through here from Joanna. And it says the OSHA regulation asks for recertification every 3 years. Does this mean a full training, or does refresher training suffice for the 3-year recertification? And I want to address that because this is a common misconception in the industry with forklift training and refresher training. So OSHA does not actually require refresher training every 3 years. What they require is the evaluation every 3 years. So, and you can see here on the screen, so the 3-year evaluation, if that shows problems, if you are doing an observation, an evaluation of your operators, and you identify unsafe behaviors, or you identify any other risks or problem areas, then you would potentially need to retrain that particular operator based on the evaluation. So this is a common misconception. We get questions on this all the time, but no, you do not need to provide blanket refresher training every 3 years for all operators. Okay, let's move on to the next screen. And another question we get common at JJ Keller is, do I have to train employees on each truck? And Yes. So what I mean by that is facilities often have different types of powered industrial trucks. So for example, some have sit-down forklifts, some have the walkie riders, powered pallet jacks, order pickers, if you're in the warehousing industry, telehandlers and reach trucks if you're in construction or working outdoors. So with that in mind, the answer is not necessarily, but you do have to train on each type of truck. So if you have 5 or 10 different outdoor telehandlers. As long as the operational features are fairly similar, you have to train them on that type of forklift. So by type, OSHA is talking about the basic differences. Again, a sit-down rider versus a stand-up truck. That is really going to be two separate hands-on training components. A lot of the classroom information may be the same or similar as far as, the hazards and like your work environment hazards and that sort of thing. But you definitely need to provide the hands-on training for each type of truck. Um, Again, an order picker versus a pallet jack. OSHA doesn't intend that you need to give refresher training because someone starts using the same type of truck made by a different manufacturer. But keep in mind that the operator will need instruction on, any topics such as the controls that are different in previous training that they may have received, that sort of thing. Okay, and duplicative training. So this is also very common, again, in construction, but also in general industry. So what about the situations where an operator has received training in the past, maybe from another employer or from, a union hall or something like that? Well, OSHA says you don't have to duplicate training topics, but there are always going to be truck specific and workplace specific issues that the employee will need training on. Just as Ed mentioned earlier, your specific work environment may have unique hazards that these people have not been exposed to yet or are not aware of. So there is always going to be some level of refresher training based on your unique workplace hazards. And in addition, regardless of the training background, remember that OSHA requires each employer to evaluate the operator prior to allowing them to drive in the workplace. So, I want to ask yourself, how much do you know about and trust the previous employer's training program? So a new employee may come to you and say, yes, I have, previous training experience from my last employer. But you don't necessarily know the content or the validity of that training. So at the end of the day, it really is up to the employer to evaluate that new operator in your workplace and, see if they're comfortable with the equipment, are safety minded, and so on. So one area that can often go overlooked in your training program is the discussion of pedestrians. Anyone who will be in the area where forklifts operate should have some training on how to interact with that equipment. So they should know to listen for warnings, to stay alert and not be distracted. They should know how to report unsafe activity if they observe an operator driving unsafely. They should know, to look at convex mirrors if they're placed throughout your facility. Everyone should know what the facility's policy is on, right-of-way traffic. Especially in like warehousing environments and that sort of thing, where there may be obstructed views. I do encourage you to interview, 5 of your forklift operators and then 5 pedestrians, and they should all be able to tell you the same thing regarding your company's right-of-way policy. And if you're getting different answers or confusion or questions, then it's definitely worth looking at, both for your operators and the people around them. And with that in mind, we're going to switch gears, and Ed is going to talk about inspections.
All right, thanks, Gina. Okay, so OSHA requires you to train forklift operators on how to perform vehicle inspections. And well, if there's maintenance, maybe that's a different crew, not the operator, but whoever's going to be doing those tasks. So here we're going to talk about the OSHA requirements. We'll discuss what the inspection consists of, when an issue warrants taking the vehicle out of service, and we'll talk about documentation of inspections and if it's a requirement, because we get that question a lot. Okay, so first, OSHA requires the inspections be done daily prior to use or after each shift if it's used around the clock. Most people do it at the start of the shift. Generally, the inspection consists of two parts. First, the operator does a pre-start visual with the key off, and then the operator performs an operational check with the engine running. I'll get into more detail in a bit, but of course, you want to check the manufacturer's recommendations. Each truck may have specific features or unique inspection needs. And obviously, whether you're running a diesel or an electric or a propane, all of these could change what you inspect. And I want to mention before we move on, for forklifts that aren't used daily, they don't need to be inspected daily. So there's a letter of interpretation that says if a forklift is not used every day, if it's in storage, uh, then you don't need to do an inspection until you're ready to place it into service. All right, so here's some general items you want to train your operators to check when they do that pre-start. And these are common to most forklifts. Again, they don't come from an OSHA standard, but they are recommended in OSHA's online forklift e-tool. So fluid levels, leaks, cracks, defects, pretty much all the parts of the forklift you can check with the engine off. And giving close scrutiny to tires, fork condition, really anything that could jeopardize safety. And there's going to be additional items for electric forklifts, propane forklifts. Remind your operators that they may need additional PPE, personal protective equipment, for that inspection. So, obviously, with electric forklifts, there's the battery's electrolyte potential exposure, and for LP gas, you can get freeze burn. So, these are all different considerations. And then after that pre-operation, they should they should know how to conduct an operational inspection with the engine running. And this typically includes things like the drive control. Can the forklift move in forward reverse? Do the forks tilt forward and back? Does the horn work? Do the brakes function? If it's got lights, are they functioning? Are we raising and lowering the forks without any problems? And again, aside from the items we've mentioned, do check the manufacturer recommendations as well. And then, while not related to training, we do want to mention something about documenting inspections and keeping those records. Uh, Believe it or not, OSHA does not require documenting your daily forklift inspections. They don't have to be in writing. And that means, of course, there's no specific retention time if you do decide to document them. I mean, having a checklist is extremely helpful when you have a long list of things to do. So even though it's not required, either a written or electronic checklist is a good idea because, it helps ensure that the operator covers all the essential features, and it also can provide evidence to an OSHA compliance officer that the vehicles were in fact inspected as required, like whether it's each shift or each day, whatever. So, all right, I'm going to turn it back to Gina to continue this conversation a bit.
All right. Thank you, Ed. Yes, so we've selected this group of topics to cover in a little bit more detail since we do get a lot of questions on them. So designated areas, speed limits, traveling on ramps and inclines, operating around railroad cars, and unattended forklifts. So these topics can fall under both the OSHA truck-related topics as well as the workplace-specific topics that we've already mentioned. There are 11 different designations of powered industrial trucks. So that includes diesel, electric, gasoline, liquefied petroleum, gas powered, and we list these on the slides. Some of these do have minimum acceptable safeguards against inherent fire hazards. So in order to figure out what forklifts can be used where, you must first classify the atmosphere in the location that they're going to be operating in to figure out whether it is considered hazardous or non-hazardous. OSHA does have a table on this in the regulations. In 1910 178, table N1 goes into detail on the use of different industrial trucks in various locations. We don't really have enough time to get into further detail on that today, but you can look at OSHA's regulations for more information there. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, so speed limits, yes. OSHA does not really specify the speed limits that employers must post and operators must follow. There's no set speed limit for safely operating a forklift. They do kind of generally address it in some of their letters of interpretation and in the 1910 178 standard. It just requires operators to follow authorized plant speed limits. So again, it's going to be up to the employer. Kind of general rule of thumb is, safe walking speed, You don't want operators to be speeding, especially around pedestrians. Um, from OSHA's point of view, speed limits would be determined by a number of factors, including the type of the truck, the limitations put in place by the manufacturer. They may have recommended speed limits, the type of load that's being carried, and the surface that the load is being carried on. Stopping distance between locations. We've already talked a lot about pedestrian traffic, but all of these kind of come into play when determining your safe speed limits at your workplace. While specific speed limits are not available, OSHA has said that it would consider the totality of circumstances surrounding the operation of the forklift when determining whether safe travel speeds are practiced. So if they come on site and observe something and they think an operator is driving, way too fast and you have a speed limit posted, it's going to be up to discussion and it's going to be, really based on the scenario at hand. There is an industry standard. I'll mention it briefly. ANSI B56.1. They do have some tables and formulas that may help you determine appropriate speed in your facility. Let's go to the next slide, please, Ed. So ramps and inclines. This is a topic that can be confusing both for operators and employees, or I'm sorry, and employers. OSHA does have an online e-tool that helps address this topic. But with a typical sit-down forklift, you'll always have to point the forks up the incline when carrying a load, regardless of the direction of travel. So in other words, going up the incline, operators need to drive forward, point the forks, upgrade, and use a spotter if necessary if the load blocks their view. Now, when going down the incline, the operator will need to drive in reverse, turning their head and facing downgrade with the forks pointed upward. Again, that's when the forklift is carrying a load. But on the other hand, when traveling without a load, the fork should point downgrade regardless of direction of travel. So operators will drive in reverse, going up the incline, and drive forward going down the incline. This is where videos and, online tools and that sort of thing can come in handy. We have these diagrams here. And again, you can get more detail from the OSHA regulation. But with that, I'm going to pass it back to Ed.
Thank you so much. All right, just a couple other items we want to cover, and then we'll get to your questions. It's common to have forklifts enter semi-trailers, obviously, but there are hazards with this. The first one, of course, is that the trailer could walk away from the dock if the brakes on the truck aren't set or wheel chocks or some other measures aren't used. Another is that the floor of the trailer might not be strong enough to handle the weight of the forklift you're using, or it might be damaged. It's important to train your operators to check the floor for damage or weakness before they go driving in there. Another is that the freight may have shifted around, making it unstable. Operators need to be aware of this before they try to uh, load up their forklift in there. And of course, jacks may be necessary. They're not required, but OSHA says they may be needed to support the semi trailer and prevent tipping or upending while a truck enters, while a forklift enters the trailer, but it's not hooked up to another vehicle. For railroad cars, operators must know how to use wheel stops and other protection to prevent them from moving. And that applies when unloading railroad cars using dock boards or bridge plates. And of course, when traveling across railroad tracks, you go across them on a diagonal. Now, when operators are often confused about the rules is for leaving a forklift unattended. Gina mentioned this earlier. So what does the operator do when they get off the truck? Well, if they get off the forklift, but it's still in their view and it's 25 feet away or less, and they're going to get back in the truck and continue working, OSHA says the forks must be lowered, controls neutralized, and brakes set. If the operator is more than 25 feet away, regardless of whether they can or can't see the forklift, your forks lowered, controls neutralized, brake set, and the power turned off. And frankly, you can be within 25 feet and out of view. So keep that in mind too. So that about wraps it up. I think we covered a lot today, and forklift training requirements, the OSHA requirements are pretty comprehensive. So quick overview, we talked about the blended approach with classroom training, practical instruction, and then that hands-on evaluation. Talked about the importance of that operator evaluation and those 3-year evaluations, reevaluations. Talked about refresher training and when that's required.
We discussed the truck related topics and workplace specific topics. So we hope you found all this valuable and want to thank you for joining us. Now, before we get to our questions, your questions, and turn it back to Barry, I'm going to have Gina go once more with a word from our sponsor.
Yes, thank you. So before we move on to those questions, one more time to thank our webcast sponsor, JJ Keller Training. So whatever your company's needs, JJ Keller Training can help with 24/7 access to hundreds of online training and courses across multiple industries. So today we're offering our attendees a PDF of our popular Powered Industrial Trucks Training white paper and access to a free forklift training from the JJ Keller Training program. So if you would like to take advantage of that, get your free white paper and get a free access to the forklift online training program, please indicate so in the poll. And with that, I think we're going to get ready to answer a couple of questions here.
Great. Well, thank you, Gina, and thank you, Ed, for sharing your insights with us today. Before we start the Q&A, I want to let everyone know about the evaluation survey that we're asking you to complete. The survey will open in a different screen after this webinar, and your input is really important to us because it does help us to improve our future webcasts. And we have had some terrific questions come in. Gina, I'm going to start with you. You talked a little bit about third-party trainers, and Jose asks, what type of credentials should we ask for from a third-party trainer?
Yeah, that's a great question. And really, at the end of the day, it's the same requirement as if you were training operators in-house. So whoever the trainer is, if it's somebody in-house or a third-party trainer, they need to have the knowledge, training, and experience to train other employees on that particular type of forklift. And so at the end of the day, the employer just needs to communicate with that third-party certification and make sure that, those trainers do have those qualifications.
Excellent. I have a two-part question here. Nicholas and Catherine are both asking about specific trainings. Catherine asks, do we have to have additional training if trucks are similar in style but varying capacity? And Nicholas asks about what about training with propane versus electric? Can you answer those two for us?
Yes, yeah, those are great questions. So as far as retraining on the different types of forklifts, so if they are the same classification, you don't need to train on every specific model or make of forklift. But that does bring up a good point as far as, the electric forklifts do have different hazards than propane forklifts. So you wouldn't necessarily need to send your employees through the entire program all over again. But you would need to train them on the differences between those types of forklifts if you do make that change within your business. Train them on the new hazards, the different hazards. You don't necessarily need to put them through the entire training program all over again if that's the only thing that's changing.
Okay, great. Thank you. Ed, I wanted to toss one your way. Kevin asks, what kind of training do you need if your company leases or rents a forklift? Is there different training involved there?
If you're leasing or renting the forklift for your business, no, I think your operators would still need to go through the same training program. That might be challenging. And, when we talked about having third-party trainers, this is a challenge, especially whether you're leasing a forklift or maybe the attachments you're using. So if you buy a new attachment or lease something or lease a truck that no one in your company has operated, you may need a third party trainer to go through someone who has experience using that. And I'm going to put Gina on the spot a little bit, but she was talking about barrel clamps and things. I believe even tine extensions, are those considered attachments, Gina? Because I know they change the center of gravity and the capacity of the forklift.
Yes, they are. And OSHA has a letter of interpretation on this as well. And I think I saw another question come in that's somewhat related to that as far as do we have to change our capacity plates for extensions and attachments? And the answer is yes. If you are using extensions or attachments that are not provided by the manufacturer with that forklift, you will need to reach out to the forklift manufacturer and request that to get an updated nameplate with the different calculations. Just because those attachments can vary by weight and size and configuration, and it can, as Ed mentioned, can throw off the balance and stability and different things like that. So you need to have that documented and evaluated, so that nameplate will need to be updated.
Yeah, and
Great.
and the leasing one too, I think if you're you're got all diesels and you're renting an electric, I mean, you do need to figure out
Mhm.
how to train your employees on the differences there.
Yes.
Excellent. Thank you. And thanks for touching on that question about forklift extensions. We thank you to Dan for sending in that question. Our next question here is Brian asks, can more than one person be involved in the training?
Yes.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'm sorry, Gina, I don't want to jump on you, but yeah, we very commonly see, I think we did a survey on this, something like quite a number of employers have one person do the classroom portion and the regulation, and then someone else do the practical and hands-on. Gina, to add to that?
Absolutely. And that can be beneficial in the example that I gave at the beginning of this webcast, where if your classroom trainer or your primary trainer maybe doesn't have experience with a particular attachment or something of that regard, or if they have experience with 9 out of the 10 different forklifts that you're going to be training them on, you can utilize other trainers for small components of your overall training program. The key thing to remember there is on your operator training records, you do need to indicate who the trainers were. So make sure you're capturing both names or multiple names if there are multiple trainers involved.
Excellent. And Catherine had a follow-up question about attachments. Catherine asks, do we need to record the training when it comes in regard to attachments?
So in regards to attachments, you don't need to specifically record which attachments people have been trained on. It may be a best practice, but there isn't a specific OSHA regulation that states that. Your training record needs to include, again, the name, the date, the trainers, the employees. It would be a good idea if you have multiple forklifts, multiple attachments to indicate, which ones they've been trained on. Yes.
Okay. Our next question, can you clarify, OSHA does not allow someone to operate a forklift without any formal training prior to operating. Could you clarify that?
Correct. So, all employees need formal training prior to operating forklifts. I'm not sure if I'm answering that question completely, but
You
yes.
know, when I mentioned the citation by paragraph, I was surprised how many citations there were, and I don't remember the exact number, but for employees who were operating in the workplace, but they had not yet had their evaluation, and that was something Gina mentioned. I mean, they might have gone through the classroom and the hands-on, and they're like, "All right, now go practice," and they were working in the workplace, but they hadn't gotten their certification done yet. So that's the kind of thing that, yeah, OSHA's going to ding you for that. You want to get through everything. Like you said, there's no probationary period, but you're not done until you're done.
Mhm.
Great. Ed, you talked a little bit about headphones, and Corey had an interesting follow-up to that. And he asked, does OSHA have any specific regulations around employees who may be hearing impaired and driving forklifts?
They do not. Hearing impairments, vision impairments, they've addressed that, and it really gets down to, I mean, as an employer, you can almost get into Americans with Disabilities Act on whether you can accommodate that. And really, it's going to be this evaluation of can they operate safely in the workplace. If there's going to be something they do need to hear, whether it doesn't mean they're deaf, they might have worse hearing than normal or partial loss or one ear. But if that's going to impair their ability to safely operate in the workplace or put others at risk, then they might not be a qualified operator. You can imagine like blindness in one eye really cuts your peripheral vision, that kind of thing. So OSHA doesn't say they're not going to say you can't operate if, but the employer does need to go through, look at the particular operating environment, the hazards, and determine can this person do this safely, or would this create an unreasonable risk or a threat to others?
Great. Thank you for that, Ed. Earl asks a question and he says, I know the employee does not need a driver's license. However, do they need a training completion card with a date on that card?
No, they do not need a tangible certificate or training card to keep with them at all times. Again, I think I mentioned Michigan is the one exception that we're aware of to that rule. The state of Michigan OSHA does require wallet cards for forklift trainer or forklift operators. Um, but that's the only one we're aware of. I don't think any other states do require that.
Okay, looks like we have time for one more question today. And Ed, you spoke a little bit about that 25-foot range, and Joanna asks, could you clarify within that 25-foot range, Can the operator leave the forklift on even if they do not have eyes on the vehicle?
Uh, and Gina, I'm going to defer a little bit here, but when I was a forklift operator, they're like, if you're hopping down for more than just to grab something right next to the truck, turn it off, turn the key off.
Oh,
But yeah, if you're, like I said, I think the rule was, Gina, if you're within 25 feet and inside of the truck. Well, the problem is you could be 15 feet from the truck, but around a corner and you're no longer inside of it. Gina?
mhm. Right. No, you answered it perfectly, Ed.
Okay.
It's really about the distance is how OSHA will
Yeah.
look at that if you're within
It
25 feet or not.
distance and insight. So both
Yes.
of those have to be present.
Great. Well, thank you both for the discussion today. Folks, unfortunately, we've run out of time. We thank you all for attending, and we'd appreciate you taking just a minute to share your feedback via our survey. A big thank you goes out to our awesome presenters, Gina Godin and Ed Zaleski, and of course, everyone from our sponsor, Ed JJ Keller. This ends today's Safety and Health Magazine webcast. Take care, everyone, and have a safe day.